Hey y'all, and welcome back to the show. So, Afrobeats singer Debunks has joined the long list of high profiles accused of rape, harassment, or sexual misconduct in Nigeria. His alleged victim, Seyitan Babatayo, released a statement where she recounted being arrested without a warrant by Nigerian police for telling her story on social media. Seyitan went on to say that she was handed over to Debunks' team, who then coerced her into admitting that her accusations were nothing but a publicity stunt. Unsurprisingly, the revelation sparked outrage in the West African country. As we witnessed a second wave of protests in just a few months, can this moment be one of reckoning about sexual violence against women and girls and the systems that enable such violence not only in Nigeria but also the rest of Africa? Stay with us as we attempt to answer this question and many more on this week's Beyond the Noise. Justice for Uwa, justice for Tina, we are tired. These are just some of the many social media campaigns that have gained traction on African Twitter in recent weeks. Before those, there was Sex for Grades, a hashtag that went viral in late 2019 after a BBC investigative documentary produced by journalist Kiki Mordi revealed the rampant sexual misconduct culture in Ghanaian and Nigerian universities. That story namely led to the suspension of a University of Lagos lecturer caught on camera propositioning an undercover reporter. But since the beginning of the year, the situation seems to have taken a turn for the worse. According to Nigerian police, 717 incidents of rape were reported in the first 5 months of the year and during the COVID-19 lockdown. So we caught up with Lagos-based journalist Shola Lawal on the latest wave of outrage and the spike in rape cases since the pandemic started.
There's been recent outrage over the rape cases that have been recorded over the past few months, especially during the lockdown. And that was sparked really by the rape and murder of a 22-year-old student. Her name was Uwa. She was actually in church studying because of the lockdowns. Schools had been shut down for a while. So she was in church studying and she was violently assaulted, she was raped, and she was murdered with a fire extinguisher. We've seen these kind of cases before. These certainly aren't new. 1 in 4 Nigerian women have been assaulted, have been abused violently, especially as children.
Shola also explained why it is particularly challenging for victims to report being raped or harassed.
The police don't seem to be well trained in, the management of such cases. There's a lot of ridicule that women have to go through, to kind of get their points across. So many people just decide to keep quiet about it. And even when those cases are properly reported, the police and in general the judiciary, the process is so slow and that women really just give up hope. Out of the uncountable number of rape cases that happen in the country, only about 5% are reported. And out of those 5%, only 3.5% of women actually get the justice or the psychosocial support that they need. I mean, we have seen some change. Governors did come out to say there will be a state of emergency declared in all 36 states across the country. But only a few, I believe 1 or 2 governors have actually followed up to enforce laws that will deter predators. I mean, we saw something similar in Sierra Leone where last year President Julius Maada Bio came out to declare a state of emergency on rape after a 5-year-old was paralyzed after she was raped by her uncle. But just weeks after Nigerians protested the death of Uwa, Sierra Leoneans also came out in the streets and protested the death of Khadija Sako, another 5-year-old who was raped and then strangled. I'm getting a sense of deja vu all over again because I'm reading that President Bio is angry and that he's claiming that more needs to be done. And it just feels like there's a lot of performative action going on. We need to see our governments, our lawmakers, we need to see them do more.
Now, let's shift our attention away from Nigeria and its news cycle for a second and look at the rest of the continent. The truth is, the situation is quite grim in many other countries. The World Population Review lists 4 African countries amongst the 10 countries with the highest rates of rape. That's essentially the number of incidents per 100,000 citizens. Now, you might say or think that since those countries are concentrated in the southern part of the continent, it's more of a regional issue. But the assessment is only partially representative of the reality on the ground. Indeed, if you look closely at that map, you notice that no data on rape is available in 28 African countries. That in itself is problematic and a possible indicator that there are no adequate policies on sexual violence in those places. Needless to say, we have to address the language around rape and other forms of sexual violence. Because contrary to a common belief, rape doesn't only happen when the victim physically resists or if he or she is physically injured or coerced. It essentially comes down to the notion of consent, which in the Me Too era should probably have become general knowledge by now. Think about consent as the ability to make a decision about what happens to your body, sums up Sarah L. Cook, a professor of psychology at Georgia State University. Consent is not granted forever. Consent can be given or taken away at any moment in time, but more importantly, I think it is crucial to be able to identify and call out institutionalized and culturally perpetuated sexually violent behaviors. In a country like Mauritania, for example, despite the adoption in 2017 of a law on reproductive health and of a general code on children's protection, Mauritanian law does not adequately define and criminalize sexual violence. According to Human Rights Watch, the lack of a definition of rape and other forms of sexual assault in domestic law heightens the risk for survivors to be prosecuted. If women and girls cannot convince judicial authorities that a sexual act was non-consensual, they can find themselves transformed from accuser into accused. What this means in a nutshell is that in societies where rape is taboo, victims often find themselves vilified and demonized for only speaking up. Now, this week on our interview segment, we pass the mic to a fierce Cameroonian journalist and women's rights activist. A survivor of domestic violence, Minou Chrys-tayl shares her personal story of trauma, her mental health journey, her stance on African patriarchy, everyday sexism, and the need for a more organized African women lobbying force. Hello, and thank you for being on the show. I'm really good, Hannane. Thank you for having me. A new wave of outcry against sexual abuse seems to have been ignited on the African continent. You have had your own struggle with abuse, and since then, you have adopted a very different perspective on the matter. Can you tell us more about that? I spoke out against the violence that I was subjected to by my ex partner. It was difficult to get there because I thought I'd be alone. I was afraid that by speaking up, I would shake up some women who didn't want to hear the truth. But then I realized that thousands are in a similar situation, be it subjected to sexual harassment, rape, or domestic violence, which can encompass other types of abuses such as psychological, economic, physical violence, but also social violence. This means that they lock you into your house and ostracize you from other people, from your loved ones. The Me Too movement hasn't quite taken on the African continent yet, but we're getting there. I remember many journalists a few years ago wondered why Africa was taking so long to embrace it. I think there are two reasons. First, we don't have the ideal connectivity, but also our societies are very different. We haven't fully grasped the concept of sexual violence. The fact that women don't know what words to put on the violence that they face is problematic. The fact that women don't know how to identify the abuses that they're faced with is part of what is causing this delay. What's interesting is that you had a very similar experience. It took you a while to realize the trauma that you were subjected to. This might also have been the result of that culture that you mentioned, which tends to encourage women to be patient and tolerate the bad in a marriage or in a relationship. Would you say that that deterred you from speaking up and leaving sooner? Of course it did. My ex partner told me straight up, you have to behave like an African woman. You're in Benin, behaving like an African woman means being quiet. So, that along with the fear that was there, a grappling fear, and, well, simply the shame of realizing that you have been abused. And then you start telling yourself, how could I accept the beating? What are people going to think of me? There is this fear of the public eye, of the public scrutiny, and how people are going to judge you. I was known as this fighter, this brave woman, and then that happened to me. So you start to tell yourself that you deserve to be treated the way you are. So, yeah, all of this anxiety contributed to the choice to remain silent. And then on top of that, there was the fear of failure. On some level, I wanted to be the woman who was married, and I managed to convince myself that this was part of marriage, despite having had a different education. In our countries, there isn't much research done on this. In the US, in Europe, they have conducted this research on this kind of violence. My ex threatened my life. And when I would complain, I would have other women tell me, well, you have a nice house, nice things. So you were made to believe that being that wife and having a home, that should make you feel important enough. There's also the issue of trauma and mental health that such violence often causes. And once again, for cultural reasons, those are not aspects that we explore and discuss enough on the African continent. What is your take on this? Absolutely. We refuse to admit that violence against women is a matter of mental health, which it is because when you've gone through such trauma, your mental health takes a hit, including your physical health. We notice that women who face such violence will develop cancers, cardiovascular diseases. Some of them experience acute agoraphobia, which was my case for a while. Unfortunately, we don't have psychotraumatologists on the ground to help us heal. There are no experts on traumatology. Actually, there are no victimology centers on the African continent. We let sexism and patriarchy foster those issues, and then we have no cure for the diseases that they create. Oftentimes, a child that grew up seeing his mother getting beaten up by his father will reproduce the same pattern. That has been proven time and time again. So, we don't need ministries of women empowerment. We need ministries of women's rights. We need to stop reducing women to the role of a home keeper. This should be the responsibility of both individuals, and a woman should not be reduced to being the guarantor of the household or the family life. That is too much responsibility put on her. When there is this much fear, women are tempted to only speak out under the condition of anonymity. However, anonymous revelations are often dismissed as a non-credible form of testimony. When it comes to anonymous testimonies, I think what's crucial is to sensitize the public and to create awareness around what coming forward and being in the public eye entails. What we must bear in mind is that 98% of testimonies are actually truthful. But some men will use the 2 remaining percent to undermine women and their accusations and the whole movement. So, of course, it's not about accusing without evidence and ruining an innocent person's life. But I truly stand behind the idea that we have to believe the victim and protect them for the mere reason that there are many predators out there. Oftentimes, women speak anonymously because in their family it's important to maintain the illusion of that social cohesion. What we need is to create a real sorority, solidarity amongst women who've been fed over and over again that they should be each other's enemies, when in fact it's not the truth. That is what toxic masculinity, patriarchy, and sexism have created. If we want women to be comfortable enough to testify openly, we have to protect the ones who do lead the way and who do testify openly. The issue is that they've been presented as losers. We need examples of rape and sexual assault cases that end well for the women who spoke up and pressed charges. What we have seen mostly is women coming forward and telling their story in vain. There are very few happy endings. Simultaneously, we don't have an organized and powerful lobbying group that can put pressure on the lawmakers and the judiciary and hold them accountable. For as long as we won't have that safe space and this unapologetic leadership for women's rights that will take on the fight for justice, women will continue to be fearful. That being said, I've noticed that more and more young women are doing their part and fighting the good fight. Well, this is it for this week's Beyond the Noise. If you or someone you know has been a victim of sexual assault or rape, there are resources available, and we will link some of those resources in the description below. If you need any additional information, do DM us and we will guide you where we can. Until next week, stay safe, as usual.